Order.
Crime and Policing Bill.
We are now sitting in public and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we begin, I would like to remind members to please switch electronic devices to silent. Tea and coffee are not allowed during sittings. Today we will first consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence for publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions before the oral evidence sessions. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without debate. I first call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in her name, which was discussed yesterday by the Programming Subcommittee for this bill.
Well, good morning, Dr. Alan Khan. And yes, I'm very minded that we have a busy day ahead of us, so I'd like to beg to move these resolutions formally.
The question is the programme motion as on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
Formally.
The question is the motion as on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence which the committee receives will be made available in the committee room. And I now call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private.
Move formally.
As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now go into private session to discuss lines. Order, order. We are now sitting in public again and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we start hearing from the witnesses, do any members wish to make a declaration of interest in connection with this bill?
Thank you, Chair. Just to declare my former occupation as a police officer, current member of NARPO, National Association of Retired Police Officers.
If any interests are particularly relevant to a member's questioning or speech, they should declare them again at the appropriate time. We now hear oral evidence from the National Police Chiefs Council, the Police Superintendents Association of England and Wales, and the Police Federation of England and Wales. We must stick to timings in the programme motion the committee has agreed. For this session, you should know we have until 12:15 p.m. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record?
I'm Tim Meyer, Chief Constable of Surrey and the National Police Chief Council Lead for Disclosure.
Good morning, I'm Tiff Lynch, Acting National Chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales.
Morning, Dan Murphy, Assistant National Secretary from the Superintendents Association.
Thank you. I call Matt Vickers.
Hi. It's a huge, broad bill with lots of measures and powers being brought forward, hopefully welcomed by all those brave men and women that you represent. Having looked at the bill, is there anything that you find concerning? Is there anything that you see as possible to improve? And more broadly, is there any measures that you'd have liked to see in the bill that aren't there?
Thank you. No, the NPCC doesn't see any measures which we think have been omitted, save perhaps for the provision on begging, which I think was in an initial draft, but we understand concerns there in respect of how that might be enforced. Overall, the NPCC is extremely supportive of the bill. It seems to us that it brings a lot of the laws up to date and frames the law in a way which is much more consistent with the way the law of crimes are now committed and enables generally much earlier intervention and also prevention on the back of the new or adapted offences which are created.
And could you just comment briefly on begging and what you saw as something that you saw coming forward to Colin, where you'd like to have seen this if we did include anything to that end?
Yes. So I think the point in respect of begging was that whilst we were generally supportive of the inclusion of nuisance begging in the provisions, it was reflected that it would require a certain amount of judgment in how to enforce that. So that's the only point that NPCC colleagues have noted that was in the original provisions, which isn't here. Other than that, they were extremely supportive.
Thank you. In relation to the overarching bill, we concur with Chief Constable Meyer that we are supportive of new legislation that brings us up to societal issues. Rather than not sounding like a broken record throughout all of the questions here, our main concern will be the infrastructure that sits behind legislation, the demand that is placed upon our officers that we represent that will actually be out there on the streets enacting this legislation, resourcing and the learning and training development of those officers that will be required to carry out.
Thank you. Yes, from the Superintendents Association, we also support the bill and the provisions within it. With any legislation, there'll obviously need to be clarity through the courts or through training or guidance that comes with the bill. And I've read with interest some of the debates for and against some of the clauses in the bill. So the power of entry with regards to electronic devices, public order, some of the definitions aren't defined within the legislation. And there's a specific concern that I've read, and it might not be a concern, but it's something that I read with regards to mandatory reporting clauses 45 to 54 and whether or not the covert nature of policing would be dealt with through an exception or through some kind of exemption with regard to that route.
Just on the entry without a warrant, obviously it's drawn more tightly, more narrowly in this bill than it was in the criminal justice bill. Do we think it gives you the tools you need to do the job, or is there any concerns about that?
I think it gives you the tools to do your job, but whenever you're entering private homes, you only got to look at the case law on warrants where we have got full powers. They're challenged regularly, so we need to make sure we're trained, we get it right. But as it is a new bit of legislation, I'm sure there will be challenges either way as to when it's used.
And just any other comments on that entry without a warrant and it being narrower in this bill or otherwise?
I think there's a role for government and Parliament to communicate that that is a power that's been given to policing, and it's not something that policing is searching for and we're trying to use it. So the public needs to understand that's been given to us for a reason and where they're using it.
Yeah.
And if I may go one step further as well, in relation to the public having that knowledge of the powers, it's also to have our police officers to have the confidence that government are behind them when they are actually enforcing these laws, so that they know that they are supported in what they're doing.
Yes, thank you. So we know that the ability to track mobile devices isn't sufficiently at the moment accurate to enable it to be relied upon without some form of corroboration, and therefore one understands why things are more tightly framed. But where there is good intelligence for its use, this ability to enter swiftly to search for stolen goods without the need to get a warrant is going to mean that we're able to recover stolen property more swiftly. It means that investigations are less likely to be frustrated. Obviously, to ensure legitimacy in the eyes of the public, that needs to be carried out carefully. But overall, it will make it less likely that property is going to be swiftly capable of being disposed of, whether that's electronic property or property linked to rural crime, and our inability currently to deal expeditiously with those sorts of crimes can impact adversely on public confidence. So overall, a very positive operational thing.
Happy?
I'll call Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Carr. Thank you very much for giving evidence today. I wanted just to follow up on the questions that you were just being asked then about the recovery of digital devices that have tracking devices in them and allowing the police to go in without a warrant. Could the actual legislation says reasonable grounds to believe, that's the test that would have to be applied, and requiring authorisation by an inspector. I just want to check with each of you that you think that is the appropriate test and authorisation level.
Well, the requirement of belief is obviously a relatively high bar because it's above, for example, suspicion. I think that reflects the need to ensure that a new power such as this is applied carefully and with appropriate corroboration. And an inspector, crucially, is going to be readily operationally available for an officer in those sort of dynamic circumstances to make contact with and get the authorisation from, because it seems to me that the thrust of the power is very much towards enabling the police to recover property quickly. So it seems that the belief is a good safeguard, the inspector is appropriately senior and accessible, so I would agree with those 2 points.
Any of the other panel members wanting to comment on that?
I just think we need to make sure we've got the right training, guidance, and because of the power that we have to expect challenge, there will be challenge. My reasonable ground to believe may be different to somebody else's around the table. We would have gone through a process of using proportionate, necessary and justified means, looking at the intelligence, evidence and what's in front of us to form that belief, but that's something different for everyone, so it's not a black and white answer with regards to how that will be decided.
But inspector level authorisation, you think is the appropriate level?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And
good morning, Minister.
Yes.
I would agree with both Mr. De Mayor and Dan Murphy on that in relation to the authorisation level. Again, I would say that we have to manage expectations in relation to victims of crime where we have locations identified and the demand that is already placed on our officers that are out there as to how speedy that recovery of that technical equipment will be made. It's about managing expectations also.
thank you. I just want to talk to you now about respect orders, and the bill will introduce respect orders for the most persistent adult offenders of antisocial behaviour. And I just wondered if each of you could say something about how these new measures will help and enable the police to tackle antisocial behaviour more effectively.
Yes, thank you. So we think the new powers, placing as they will requirements on those who've committed ASB, including positive requirements to carry out certain actions, will give us rather more flexibility in dealing with this type of behaviour. It's also preventative and restorative in some cases as well. We think the deterrent value will be greater. And also making a breach of the order a criminal offence allows us then quickly to arrest where there hasn't been that compliance. Overall, the NPCC thinks that this will enable earlier intervention. We know the very serious effect that antisocial behaviour has on community confidence and on the ability for people to engage in educational, social and economic life. So anything which enables us to deal more swiftly with problems when they're in their infancy is to be welcomed.
Do you want me to go? Thank you. Again, without repeating, we agree perpetrators can be required to address the root cause of the problems, obviously once dealt with. Again, I come back to resource and demand. Certainly on the arrest element, whilst we have perpetrators going into custody, that places a huge demand on the custody department, on police officers. We need the infrastructure that is placed behind it. And we're already seeing, certainly on custodial sentences as well, with the criminal justice system, a backlog of cases and then with prison spaces already overcrowding, we need to have the infrastructure behind this to be able to actually make it effective and believable.
And the commitment to the 13,000 neighbourhood police officers to work in communities, in high streets, in town centres, to tackle some of this antisocial behaviour, that links together, I think, quite well. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it does, Minister. But I also come back to the time and it's the follow-on processes. Once you've actually dealt with a perpetrator, it's the hours that is spent with the paperwork and the systems following that. That could wipe out our neighbourhood officers in one shift. And sadly, until we get that infrastructure and the systems that back up any law, and certainly with these new laws, demand and all the other priorities could wipe out those additional officers in one shift.
Okay. Would you like to say something from the Superintendents Association?
Yes, I think there's it's come under the banner of antisocial behaviour, which it is.
Yeah.
A lot of antisocial behaviour issues that police deal with are for those that are under the age of 18. This applies to those 18 and over. I think the power's good, but if the public think we're going to be able to use this for teenagers, obviously it is going to be there's going to be a mismatch there. I think the power of arrest is good. I do note that there is a requirement to give a warning if there is a positive requirement in the respect order, which the public again might think that the respect order has been issued, you can just go out and arrest the person. Actually, you can't. So there are a few caveats to make, obviously, the law fair and people understand what's happening and those that are subject to them. I think the power of arrest will be extremely useful. But as Tiff said, someone's got to go and make that arrest, and then someone has got to put a case file together to prove the breach. So there is work to be done and resource to be put into this, so it does need to be resourced if it's going to be successful. But I think the main point is that it is for over 18-year-olds.
Yeah. And can I just ask about the new retail offences that are in here in terms of assaults on a retail worker and the threshold, the £200 threshold being removed? I wondered how both of those will assist policing in dealing with what we've seen, this spike in shop thefts over the last few years?
Yes, thank you. When I appear at community events, I often find this £200 point is a source of great confusion and misunderstanding. So to resolve that ambiguity is extremely welcome, as it's wrongly been supposed that somehow shoplifting under that threshold is legal, which plainly isn't the case. So to resolve that ambiguity is a good thing. On the point of an offence of assaulting a retail worker specifically, I think this acknowledges the vital role that retail workers play in community and local economic life, and the disproportionate likelihood of their being assaulted in the course of their work. By creating this offence, it enables us to identify much more precisely the extent of the problem, and it also enables us to deal with the crime in circumstances which the law much more closely reflects. So it's certainly welcome from our perspective.
Thank you.
Minister, I'd like to focus on the assaults on retail workers. We support this. Nobody should go to their place of work with the expectation that they're going to be assaulted. Absolutely nobody. Again, it comes down to resourcing, but I would also, I think it's worth mentioning that the same principle was applied for the assaults on emergency workers only a few years ago. It's something that was championed by the Police Federation of England and Wales. Unfortunately, due to the backlog within the criminal justice system, we've now seen that that legislation isn't being used effectively, and actually the assaults on emergency workers legislation they're now reverting to assaults on police constables. So if we are going to be bringing in this law, we need to see strong execution of it and the support for retail workers in the same way for emergency service workers.
Okay. Mr Murphy, do you have a view on this?
No, nothing further.
Okay. If I may, just one more question. Could I just ask Tiff Lynch about the proposed changes to the IOPC's referral threshold? And I wondered if you could just say the view is that that will probably result in fewer referrals to the CPS around misconduct. I just wondered, could you explain why that's going to be beneficial?
Simply, in relation to time, the length of investigations. For far too long, the length of investigations has been an issue for police conduct. We expect that officers that do not uphold the warrant that they carry should be exited from the organisation swiftly. And those referrals will cut down on that time that we can actually have those investigations dealt with, which essentially will prevent any disillusionment from the public or from the complainant or victim, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, but also for the officer concerned.
Thank you. And so your view is that it will speed up proceedings?
One would hope.
But the threshold, the change in threshold, you support that?
Yes.
Yes. Would either the other members of the panel like to say anything on that?
Yeah, we would support that as well. Superintendents Association would support that change.
Right, thank you.
Lovely. Now call Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you very much for joining us to assist us with the bill today. I'm going to look at the clauses around concealing identity. So clauses 86 to 88, making an offence for someone to conceal their identity at certain protests. The current challenge we have around this is concerns from Hong Kongers, particularly my community, my constituency of Sutton Cheam, who are attending protests against the Chinese transnational repression in central London. They have concerns that their identities will be monitored by the CCP and then that used to conduct repression on family and friends in Hong Kong and in China. Obviously, protesting is incredibly important, that we're able to exercise our rights in a democracy to demonstrate our displeasure with whatever it is. What are your understanding of how a protest is defined? In what situations would a protest have these measures imposed? And how would somebody at one of those protests, and a good example to use is these Hong Kong protests, these Chinese protests, how would somebody be treated by officers if a designation was put in place and they were concealing their identities at these protests?
Well, it's extremely challenging to give a definitive answer as the question implies. So on the point of the definition of protest, first of all, there is, of course, no single definition of protest. There are a broad range of activities which could qualify as a protest, from one person, a gathering, a vigil, a march, the playing of music, chanting, or other sorts of circumstances. So it is a very challenging area of law and operational policing. On the point of concealing identity and the potential threat to safety in respect of transnational repression, I'm afraid, again, my response is going to be not quite as definitive as might be hoped for. We would have to apply the same judgment as we do in other areas of public order operational life, such as in relation to searching. And that means if an offence were suspected of being committed, it's for the officer to engage with the individuals in question and then to carry out a dynamic investigation of what's going on, seeking expert tactical advice where appropriate, or also senior authority. And it's important to point out that this doesn't say the power has to be used. It's what may be done, not what must be done. So it does very much come down to circumstances and the engagement and the judgment of the officer, and the advice in question is going to be vital. One would expect sensitivities such as this to be addressed through the training of the various public order operatives, the gold commanders, the silver commanders, the bronze commanders, and the public order officers themselves. And inevitably there will also be some learning through case law as well, as it emerges.
I would agree with Chief Constable. I come back to what I said earlier on. This is in relation to training and learning. The law, the confines of the law, and police officers out there during protests work within the confines of the law. They utilise the national decision-making model, and it's all about what is faced in front of them on that day. We pride ourselves on people being able to protest lawfully, and it's within those laws and the confines of the laws and how those officers act on the day and what they're presented with. So it would be determined on the day.
It's a long time since I've run a public order operation, but I think as a police officer and a commander, and we talked about neighbourhood policing, it's about talking to people.
Yeah.
So if you're presented with what you as the commander think is a protest and you think you can justify that, if you haven't got a protest that's going to cause any particular problems, why would you go down this route? Even to do a preventative thing, if you have got people there that are covering their faces and you think there is this issue that you're raising, you may just send an officer to go and speak to them, say, would you mind just identifying yourself so we know who you are, and you deal with it by talking to people.
Am I able to have a small follow-up? Thank you, Madam Chair. Just as a very brief follow-up, do you think the new powers in here are necessary? Do they allow you to do things that you wanted to be able to do at previous protests but not been able to?
But it's an extremely good point in respect to the judgment which the officer would exercise. There have plainly been circumstances where people have concealed identity as a means of escaping detection and frustrated the efforts of the authorities then to identify those who are responsible for offences within those protests, and in so doing meant we weren't able to prevent further criminal activity. So I think they're necessary, but they're to be exercised with caution and good judgment.
Many members have caught my eye, and in the interest of time, I'll only be able to get everybody in if members wouldn't mind keeping their questions very brief, if possible, please. I'd like to call David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is probably to you, Chief Constable de Meyer. Looking at knife crime, just thinking operationally, there's the new offence of possession of a knife or offensive weapon with intent to use in unlawful violence. Can you explain operationally how that perhaps bridges the gap between the current legislation of simple possession and using a bladed article or offensive weapon to threaten or harm somebody? And how is this going to help us to drive down knife crime?
Yes, certainly. So this allows for greater sanctions against those who are evidence as having or is known to be intending to cause harm. I think the important point here, it goes to the point I made at the beginning, in that the law will now more closely reflect the circumstances of the case, because the totality of the circumstances can be had to regard to when the investigation is being carried out, when the case is being presented at court, and ultimately when the sentence is being passed if the person is convicted. Because rather than relying only on the simple act of possession, the investigation and the court can have regard to the intent of the individual and the much greater seriousness of the circumstances which that implies. It also means that we'll be much better able to deliver what we term sustained public protection, because rather than simply bringing someone to justice for possessing a knife without being able to adduce evidence as to what their intention might have been, we can now adduce that evidence and what imagines come up with a tougher sentence which has much more preventative power.
Thank you.
Just to say that if the witnesses are in broad agreement, it's fine if only one person wishes to answer, unless there's something else they'd like to raise. And now call Harriet Cross.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alana Khan. If I can go back to Mr. Murphy and just pick up on the point on under 18s and respect orders. What sort of age would you like to see or think that it would be beneficial for that age limit to be reduced to, if that is what you were saying? Is there a particular age group where we see sort of prolific sort of antisocial behaviour starting to become more apparent? And also on a slightly wider point, do we think within the bill the definition of antisocial behaviour is wide enough? It says at Part 9, or Clause 9, means conduct that's caused or likely to cause harassment, alarm, distress to any person. My direct point being, is it being therefore restricted to person, or does it include instances where you have, for example, neighbourhood or property nuisance where it's impacting sort of on a larger scale but no single identifiable person can be attributed to being recipient of it?
I think on your first point, it would obviously capture more incidents and more issues if it was at a lower age. However, would we want to be criminalising children as such with this type of offence? So there's a balance, and I think it's a matter for Parliament and society as to whether or not they would like to lower that age. I can understand why it's been set at 18, but I just wanted to make the point earlier on that as it is at 18, that power would not be able to be used for young people. With regards to harassment, alarm and distress, and that's a person-specific issue compared to a community or area, I think in policing, if we could have something that would capture that as well, we would welcome it. But again, it is an extension of powers, etc. And it's about, you're putting me on the spot here, I'm thinking, how would you prove that? Who would be your witness or your injured party for a community? So putting me on the spot, I think what's provided at the moment is useful. Would it be good if it could be widened? Yes. Practically, could it be widened? I think we'd probably need a whole other committee and some lawyers to discuss that one.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Matt Bishop.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'll just take a moment to thank the panel and your colleagues for your service and continued efforts in making our community safer. I think it's important to recognise that. My question's around the measures that we're looking to implement to provide more protection against the retribution for the authorised firearms officers facing criminal proceedings for the offences related to and committed during their duties. Do you think the measures will reassure firearms officers that the government values the unique and dangerous work they do and give them more confidence moving forward to what we've experienced recently?
Yeah,
Okay. So it's important, first of all, to point out how rare it is in this country for a firearms officer to discharge their weapon, and rarer still, reassuringly, that someone dies as a result. Obviously, it's right that there's a proper investigation wherever this happens. I don't think it's in the interests of public safety for an officer doing such an important job to feel inhibited from doing what might, in extremely rare and extreme circumstances, be necessary and what they're trained to do, because they have a concern that in a subsequent investigation their name is going to be made public with all of the risk that entails to them personally. I can't say for certain colleagues here I would give a better indication as to the extent that this might assuage their concerns, but it seems to be a necessary and sensible move.
Without repeating Chief Constable de Meyer, certainly we were pleased with the Home Secretary's announcement in relation to the anonymity of firearms in those situations, and certainly for NX 121, the incident and the case that followed. Our firearms officers are volunteers, and that is key, and it really needs to be noted that they are volunteers, that they put themselves at risk, they put their lives at risk to protect society. And in cases where this is concerned, for their families and for their own well-being and what may follow on from that, it's only right for the anonymity aspect of that to be placed upon them for a period of time that is required. So yes, to answer your question specifically in relation to the reassurance of our firearms officers that are out there today, there is some reassurance, but again, it's a matter of time that they actually feel that is going to continue.
Mr. Murphy?
Yeah, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Firearms officers, like all police officers, are interested in actions rather than words, so they would like to see a difference. So I think once they start seeing that difference, that will make a difference to them. And I know that the accountability review is there's going to be some announcements on that soon. Dame Diana, I think, is involved in that. So I know the government are looking at it, and we're really encouraged that there may be some more positive steps that will lead to actions that support officers that put themselves in those most difficult situations.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
So we know that a small number of people are responsible for a huge volume of the crimes that we're discussing. Do you believe there are sufficient powers to deal with hyper-prolific offenders and imprison them? Do you think we should be doing anything in that space? I'd also be interested in the other two panel members' views on the 18, 60, whatever it might be question as well.
So to answer your question in relation to the powers, this is something that I find myself repeating, not in this forum, but in other interviews. The law, you can bring in as many laws and powers. We need to have the infrastructure, we need to have the resources. We've got officers that are out there with case files that are getting longer and longer and longer. And there is only so much that can be highlighted as a priority, and if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So yes, we support the laws, and it's for government to make the laws, it's for us to carry them out, and we will do so. But it's about that managing expectations, not just from policing, but also from society.
In terms of hyper-prolific offenders, do you think, obviously a lot of time being taken by a small number of people, do you think there's anything we can do in that space to make the job easy?
You can do if you want to.
If you've got someone who's a prolific offender and the police are constantly dealing with them and you've got constant victims, the best place for that person is in prison. Getting them into prison is sometimes not easy. So I think that's the answer.
Just a reminder, we need to keep things really short if we want to get everybody in. It may not be possible to do so. Lauren Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again for joining us today. I just wanted to pick up on your views on the new kind of youth diversion orders and the youth injunctions and how that can be supporting ASB in our communities. Just your thoughts on those, please. Thank you.
Are you just ASB or counter-terrorism?
Bit of both. So we've got the youth injunctions, which could help with the ASB, certainly in our communities, but then equally how the youth diversion orders kind of intercede and intersect.
Yes, and I agree that there is an intersection between the two. So counter-terrorism policing are certainly extremely supportive of youth diversion orders. Interestingly and concerningly, there has been a significant increase in the number of young people featuring in the casework of counter-terrorism policing. In 2019, just 4% of those arrested for a counter-terrorism offence were aged under 18. By 2023, this is 19%. And this poses serious challenges, not just in respect of the threat, but also caseload, and naturally counter-terrorism policing wants to avoid, wherever possible, criminalising young people at a very early age who might themselves have been exploited by extremists. So these orders, it's felt, will help to divert young people away from being labelled a terrorist, if I can put it that way, and engaging in further offending. It opens up the possibility of some supportive and prohibitive measures. So there's both a carrot and a stick, as you might put it. And it just enables colleagues to manage the risk at a much earlier stage than is currently the case. On the matter of prevent, which of course is long-standing, that has been essentially voluntary for young people, and there hasn't been any means to compel their involvement in the necessary diversion. We see this measure as a means of introducing just about the right amount of compulsion to that prevent set of activity without making it entirely mandatory.
Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. If I could take the panel back very briefly to the powers around face coverings in protests. Given that protests are often political in nature, does anyone on the panel see challenges presented by having to exercise that power and challenges around perception or accusations of political bias? I just wonder if I could have some reflections on the challenges that having to exercise that power will create in that field.
I think it's important to emphasise, first of all, that we won't have to exercise the power. It's a power which is open to us, which we may use, not necessarily that we must use. That having been said, of course, one accepts entirely the potential for people on one side of a debate to suggest that the power ought to have been used and that it hasn't been used on another side. I can only say that that is for commanders in each individual circumstance to ensure that they are trying to abide by the principle of policing without fear or favour, and doing so impartially. It's difficult for me to say much more than that because there are so many circumstances in which it might come to pass, but I do envisage the difficulty.
I'll keep this very quick for you. It's down to interpretation. I also think it's relevant with communication in terms of how the general public have an understanding of what police officers are out there doing. We're seeing actions of police officers on these protests being placed all over social media. It's a snippet of information, so as a result we get misinformation and disinformation, which then heightens society's frustration. So I think there is a role to play for everyone, and certainly within government, to actually communicate those powers and the actions to the public so that everyone has that clear understanding. And then it's again to have the support, certainly for the officers that we represent out there on the front line in doing what they're doing.
I'm afraid this will probably have to be the last question to this set of witnesses. I call Keir Mather.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, I had a question referring back earlier to the issues you raised around rural crime, which I think is becoming a particularly pernicious issue facing communities, especially when it comes to things like off-road bikes, fly tipping, the theft of farm vehicle equipment. Could you speak to how any of the provisions in the bill will allow police forces to better tackle rural crime as a whole?
So I agree entirely with the point in respect of rural crime. We need to acknowledge that the rural economy, the custodians of our countryside, and how important that is, and policing needs to do more in respect of bringing those to justice. There is, if I'm not mistaken, a provision in the bill relating to the point about the swift recovery of electronic devices, which I think enables us to do so more swiftly in respect of crime, which is the proceeds of some sort of rural crime offence as well. This is a category of crime where the proceeds are often disposed of very quickly to other parts of the country and indeed overseas. And very often, of course, those pieces of equipment or devices also have tracking capability. So anything which enables us more swiftly to respond to those and recover that property gives us a much better chance of bringing to justice those offenders than has been the case in the past, and also is likely to have a considerable deterrent value for organised crime groups and the opportunistic criminals too.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think
the provision for seizing vehicles without giving notice now, without going into detail, I think that would definitely assist.
Yes.
probably squeeze one more quick one in, David.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just want to quickly associate myself with the member for Forest Dean and thank you for your service. And Tiff, I had a question. When we met in January, I was very grateful for the briefing. Part of what we discussed was neighbourhood policing, which is a key theme in this bill. Could you offer any assessment you've done of this bill's effectiveness in helping neighbourhood policing?
Neighbourhood policing is the bedrock of policing. It's something that I've always believed in, and we've discussed that privately. The officers that are out there, the police community support officers that are out there working with communities, and this bill, I come back to what I said before, this bill will go some way to bring us in line with how society is changing so that we can actually use the laws to keep the public safe. But again, it comes down to what is the investment in policing for us to be able to enact those laws. And it comes not, and when I talk about investment, it's about people, it's about systems, it's about infrastructure.
Order, order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. I thank our witnesses on behalf of the committee for their evidence. We will now hear oral evidence from the Right Honourable Sir Robert Buckland, KBE KC, and Oliver Sells KC. Again, we must stick to the timings of the programme motion that the committee has agreed. For this session, we will have until 12:45 p.m. Those that want to ask questions should catch my eye, and for those who I wasn't able to get in this time, I will try and prioritise you first. Hello. Hello. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record?
I'm Sir Robert Buckland, former member of this place, former Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary, Solicitor General, Secretary of State for Wales and Minister of State for Prisons.
I'm Oliver Sells. I practiced in the world of criminal justice for many years, and I've sat at the Old Bailey for many years.
Lovely. I call Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Khan, and it's very nice to see you again, Sir Robert. I wondered if I could just start by asking you, what do you welcome in this crime and policing bill?
There's a lot to welcome in every crime bill, particularly the need to update the response of police and law enforcement to the growing risks posed by technology. We're living in an age now with extrinsic challenge of technologies right through from digital to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Means that I think it is an absolutely reasonable expectation of the public to make sure that the police and our other law enforcement agencies are up to speed, most notably on the seizure of mobile telephone devices and the analysis of evidence. There is a growing crisis, we see it in our court backlogs, which is sadly largely caused by the failure of the system to really be able to deal at speed with the vast amount of data that needs to be analysed in order to either build up a case or to properly challenge it in accordance with the tried and tested rules. I should have added, Dr. Alan Khan, that I'm of course back at the bar. I was myself a former part-time judge, and obviously I make any appropriate declarations. But there's a lot to welcome in the bill. I'm pleased to see child criminal exploitation. There might be more I'd like to say about that if we can have that conversation. But like all bills with a wide scope of this nature, one is always left thinking, what else can we do? And I'm sure that as this bill goes through both houses, you'll be posed with lots of challenges and hopefully adopt some of the suggestions that are made by the many people who take a great interest in this legislation.
Thank you. Can I pick you up on the child criminal exploitation and the offence that's set out in the bill?
Yes.
You said that there might be more that you'd like to have seen on that. Could you just expand on that?
Yes, I noted the way that it is defined, and I entirely understand that there needs to be clarity about criminal activities of children. But I do think that, and you'll be familiar with this from our work when we were here, about the position of children who are exploited. It isn't always going to be exploitation that results in their commission of a criminal offence. The forced labour of children, the sexual exploitation of children, the financial abuse of children will often not involve them committing a criminal offence at all. And whilst, I'm not being glib here, what I see this particular offence being characterised as a Fagin-type offence, rather than something wider that can actually serve to protect children and allow the police and enforcing authorities to take that early action and early intervention where they see children at risk. And that's why I think some of the ideas by FPAT and others about expanding the definition so that you've got a very clear definition of what exploitation is, rather than just leaving it to the courts to decide, I think would be a real opportunity seized here, rather than one that I think you might be missing if you restrict the Clause 17 in those terms.
Thank you, that's helpful. Could I just ask you about cuckooing as
yes.
well? What's your view about the cuckooing offence?
Very supportive of that proposal. There was an amendment that I signed together, I think, with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Wood, whatever his seat is now. I know it's been changed. And I supported it. I had a lot of evidence of cuckooing issues in my constituency, the exploitation of vulnerable people, often adults with a learning disability, vulnerable people being befriended by unscrupulous criminals and then having their premises used and abused for the supply of drugs drugs and indeed other criminal activities. So I strongly support cookering.
Thank you. Am I allowed one more? Yes, okay, thank you. Mr Sells, I just wondered if I could ask you about the provisions within the bill around sim farms and what you think about that particular measure that's being introduced.
I think it's a very important measure. The range of novel criminal offences is exponential in my experience now. We're seeing a complete change in the criminal code and conduct in relation to SIMs and use of people in those contexts. I particularly want to refer, if I may, for a moment, to the backlog in the criminal courts. I do think, and I do feel very strongly that for victims of serious crime, and most of the crime that I try is serious sexual offences, where there are young female, male complainants waiting to give evidence in their cases, now for 2 or 3 years routinely. I think this is a completely unacceptable situation, and Parliament and this committee should be focusing all its laser energy on reducing the backlog in the Crown Court, because that's where it is, and looking at productivity, because I think productivity is too low, if I'm honest, and I think you should be looking at the number of courts sitting. I look today, for instance, online, you can go online and look at the Central Criminal Court, what percentage of the courts are sitting there on a routine basis? In my judgment now, it's too low, for whatever the complex reasons may be. And one of the clauses I wanted particularly to speak about today was clause 16, the theft from shops. Now, I recognise there's a great public anxiety about this particular issue. Shoplifting has become endemic and almost non-criminal at the same time. It's a curious dichotomy, it seems to me. But I don't think for a moment, I'm sorry to be critical, but I don't think that making theft from a shop, irrespective of value, triable either way, is the right answer. Because what that will do, inevitably, is push some of these cases up into the Crown Court from the Magistrates' Court. Now, I understand the reasons behind it and the concerns of the union and shop workers and the like. However, I think it's the wrong way. I think that one of the things we must do now in this country is reinforce the use and the range of magistrates' courts and bring them back to deal with serious, low-level crimes, which are very frequent in their areas. They know how to deal with them. They need the powers to deal with them. I still don't think their range of powers is strong enough. You need to take cases out of the Crown Court, such as these, in my judgment. And I think it's a serious mistake. I can see why people want to do it, because they want to signify that it's a very important offence in relation to shop workers. And I recognise that. I've tried many such cases of assaults on shop workers and the like, which come up to the Crown Court on appeal. And we all know the difficulties they cause, but you will not solve it. And I think also you need to look more widely. This bill does begin to look at it, as to where the line is to be drawn between the Magistrates' Courts and the Crown Court. What offences should be triable in the Magistrates' Court? And I think I'm going to slightly range a little wider into the third tier, which has been suggested as a proposal. I'm not convinced there's a need for a third tier myself. I think you need to enhance the first tier of Magistrates' Courts, which are in effect small local juries. I think the composition of Magistrates' Courts has changed completely in the last 5-10 years. You're now getting people who are local, experienced, young, range of people. They're perfectly able to try these cases, in my judgment. You should take it out of the Crown Court and leave the Crown Court for really serious offences. That's my view.
Thank you. You've given us lots of food for thought there.
There you are.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to call Matt Vickers.
Yeah, having looked at the bill, is there anything that gives you cause for concern? We'd obviously have be interested in Robert's views on that £200 threshold as well. And any measures that you'd like to have seen in this bill that you haven't seen in this bill?
A couple of things, Mr Vickers. I think, first of all, to just build on Mr Sells's point on Clause 16. Whilst I understand a huge concern about shoplifting and a perception by many shop proprietors in all our towns and cities that in some ways it was almost becoming decriminalised, that action has to be taken. But I think that the danger in changing primary legislation this way is that we send mixed messages, and the government is sending mixed messages about what its policy intentions are. Now, Sir Brian Leveson is conducting an independent review into criminal procedure. We don't know yet what the first part of that review will produce, but I would be very surprised, Dr Alan Khan, if there wasn't at least some nod to the need to keep cases out of the Crown Court, bearing in mind the very, very dramatic and increasing backlog that we have. Now, I think anything that would run contrary to that view risks the government looking as if it's really a house divided against itself. And it seems to me that there was a simpler way of doing this. When the law was changed back in 2014, there was an accompanying policy guideline document that allowed for the police to conduct their own prosecutions for shoplifting with a value of under £200 if the offender hadn't done it before, if there weren't other offences that were linked with it, if it wasn't a combined amount that took it over £200, if it was a guilty plea. Now, what seems to have happened in the ensuing years is that has built and developed into frankly, a culture that has moved away from the use of prosecuting as a tool in its entirety. And I think that's wrong, but I do think that it is within the gift of ministers in the Home Office and officials in the Home Office and the MOJ to say, well, that guidance is superseded. We hope and expect and want and expect all offences to be prosecuted. That would then allow offences of under £200 to be prosecuted in the Magistrates' Court. There's nothing in the current legislation that prevents any of that, by the way. And it, I think, would send a very clear message to the police that they are expected to do far more when it comes to the protection of retail premises. When it comes to clause 14, which is the assault on retail workers, I was a little surprised to see that a departure had been made from, I thought, a rather interesting amendment that was made in the previous session, in the 2023-24 Criminal Justice Bill, by, I think it was the member for Nottingham North, and I think it's supported, in fact, by you and others, to amend the law to increase protections for shop workers, but with an important expansion. So it wouldn't just be an assault, it would be a threatening or abuse offence as well, which would encompass some of the public order concerns that many of us have around shop premises and corner shops and sole proprietor retail outlets. And yet we've gone back here to a straight assault clause, which in my mind doesn't seem to add anything to the criminal code at all. You know, we've got existing laws of assault that were often the argument of ministers, including me, in the past when debating these issues. And it seemed to me that using this opportunity to widen the offence to cover different types of abuse to important retail workers is again an opportunity that at the moment is being missed. So if I was advising government, which of course I'm not, I would ask them to look again at that clause and consider expanding it to make it much more meaningful for the people that I think all of us want to protect.
And then in terms of, the Criminal Justice Bill, there was amendments come forward that would have seen it mandate a ban, a tag or a curfew for anybody responsible for 3 incidents of shoplifting or assault on a retail worker. What were your thoughts on that? It's something that's been taken out of this bill.
Again, a missed opportunity. I think that accompanying that type of behaviour is a natural community concern about the prevalence of people who are, well, they're worse than nuisances, they're real menaces to the well-being of a local community, because an attack on a shop, in my view, is an attack on the well-being of the whole local community. You think about how important the local shop is as a lifeline for many people, including older and vulnerable customers. Then any attack on it that means that its services are lost, even temporarily, is, I think, a very serious attack on the community. And therefore, using this opportunity to increase the suite of preventative measures available would seem to me to be a very sensible thing to do, and I would hope the government would consider any amendments that no doubt will be tabled with that aim in mind.
And then in terms of hyper-prolific offenders, we know this small group of people who are responsible for huge volumes. Do you think there's anything else we could be doing in that space to tackle the problem of hyper-prolific offenders?
Now, that's a very difficult one. I looked at that very carefully in government. And one of the challenges is, of course, the offences might be prolific, but the sentences that they carry are not very often ones that even cross the custody threshold. I think there are two ways of looking at this. I think, first of all, there is the community-based intensive intervention solution, which seems to me to be working, particularly in the case of young offenders, and which I think we should be looking at expanding and applying to adult offenders as well. But, of course, there will be a huge concomitant cost, particularly to the probation service and to all the agencies that will be tasked with the intensive supervision, maybe of a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, the sort of work that is going to have to, without sending them to a meaningless short-term sentence, take them off the streets and get them cleaned up. Then at the other end, there are the people who are, committing hundreds of offences for whom there isn't as yet a cumulative answer that the law can provide. It's very difficult for me on the hoof to suggest to you how we would encompass a sentencing option that would, in effect, allow a roll-up so that there was a longer term of imprisonment for somebody who was prolific. And the danger with it is always there'll be a cliff edge. If somebody's committed 24 offences rather than 25, why would there be such a differential? So I think that the long-term answer lies in prevention, and I think the intensive community-based approach, which at the moment is just not available to the courts, would be the one that I would strongly endorse.
So really that would be my retail hobby horse, but more broadly, any concerns about the bill or anything you'd like to see featured that isn't featured in the bill, any measures you'd like to see brought forward?
Could I touch on one subject which troubles me? It's implicit in the bill, and it's not necessarily a popular view. I think some of the trend towards sentencing inflation has created a growing prison population of particularly young serial offenders who are serving longer and longer sentences. And that itself is causing difficulties within the cost of the prison population, what to do with people who can't send to prison. The courts struggle the whole time, let me tell you, not to send people to prison, and this is absolutely necessary, for instance. And the idea that you could, for instance, abolish short sentences, there's a proposal for removal of short sentences, seems to me very double-edged indeed. You need to be very careful. The court must have the powers, including the magistrates' court, to move swiftly. One of the problems in our system at the moment, particularly in this kind of crime that we're talking about here, when I started out at the bar, these cases were dealt with overnight, next day, done and dusted, in the magistrates' court, very effective and speedy. Speedy justice is much more effective than slow justice. We've created a situation, a structure over many years now, where there is almost an acceptance of delay into the system. And I don't accept that at all. The number of adjournments you see if you go to a magistrate's court, the number of times cases are adjourned because it's not ready, they're piffling reasons on the whole, complete nonsense in my view. When a case is prepared and overnight, it should be in the court within a matter of days and dealt with straight away. And I don't think we've really understood that in this bill. It's not quite there yet, in my view.
And just to add, Mr Vickers, I do think that this bill, with its wide scope, is an opportunity for the government now to act upon, for example, the recommendations of Jonathan Fisher, KC, as to the overdue reform of disclosure. Disclosure rules that were created back in 1996 are now no longer fit for proper purpose. Anything that this bill can do to help future-proof the use of assistive technologies would seem to me to be a great opportunity for ministers and officials. I'm absolutely convinced that the use of assistive, and I use this word assistive technology, not technology to replace the judge or the jury, but to assist them in their deliberations and to assist disclosure officers and to assist the police in their investigations, seems to me to be absolutely right. Thank you. Sorry, thank you.
We have already used 2/3 of the time allotted for our eminent witnesses. I would, as time is fleeting, in order to get all members of the committee in that would like to ask a question, I request that people keep their interventions as short as possible in order to cover the greatest amount of content. Thank you. I'd like to call Anna Sabine.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to pick up on something Mr Sells said about Crown Court backlogs. I have a particular constituent who's still waiting 2 years after a serious sexual assault and says that time lapse has been more traumatic than the assault itself was. You mentioned low-value shoplifting as something that you were concerned might add to Crown Court backlogs.
Yes.
Are there other things in this bill which may do that, or indeed things you'd like to see in this bill which would help reduce court backlogs more generally?
Oh dear, I don't think time permits me to answer that question in the way that I would like. Goodness gracious. I'll give you the short answer. Yes, there are a whole load of things, but I haven't got time to spell them out for you now. I don't think that people understand somehow how the courts want to strive to get cases through, but are struggling to do so. There's an enormous amount of goodwill both in the Magistrates' Court and the Crown Court. But for all kinds of various reasons. I mean, let me give you one example. Prison transport. Why are we so reliant on defendants being brought from prison every day for long distances to Crown Courts? I see no justification for it in many cases. I've tried cases recently where the defendant is sitting in Reading Prison and the complainant is giving evidence on her phone in a Tesco's car park. And there is nothing wrong with that at all, in my view. It's perfectly satisfactory, and it prevents all the difficulties of people coming to court and delay. If I had my way, I would change it very radically in terms of the procedural rules in the Crown Court and the Magistrates' Court. I think we're too slow, I think we're too timid, and I think there is a form of institutionalised idleness within some parts of the sector.
Thank you, Chair. So, Robert, I think it was during your tenure as Justice Secretary, you acknowledged that the number of people prosecuted and convicted for rapes had fallen to the lowest levels since records began, including having more than halved in the space of 3 years, while the number of reported rapes was still increasing. I just wondered, what specific measures did the previous government implement to address the shortcomings? Do you believe that those efforts were sufficient to meet the victims' needs? And how do the new measures that this current government is pursuing help to take this important work further?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because it was a real judgment call on my part how to deal with what were unacceptable figures. And I thought it was far better as the responsible Secretary of State to fess up and to apologise, frankly, for the way in which things had happened. It was through nobody's deliberate fault. But if you remember a case called Liam Allen, a young man who was accused of rape and who was about to face trial when disclosure of very important text messages totally undermined the prosecution case, and rightly it was dropped. That and other cases of its nature had a bit of a chilling effect, to use a well-worn phrase in these precincts, upon the appetite for risk, frankly, that prosecutors had when it came to rape. And I think that we then entered a sort of cul-de-sac whereby, because of concerns about disclosure, because of concerns about the threshold, we saw fewer and fewer cases being brought. It was also compounded by the fact that many complainants and victims, when faced with that rather Manichaean choice between giving over your phone for months or carrying on with your phone, which is, let's face it, the basis of your life, were saying, no thank you, I don't want any more of this, and frankly I don't want to be put through the mill again, bearing in mind the trauma that I've already suffered. So the attrition rates were really high, and therefore I thought it was very important that we, the police as well, that the CPS really looked again at the way in which those cases were investigated. And that's why I thought it was important that we had things like the 24 guarantee about the return of phones, that Operation Soteria, which was the rollout operation refocusing the way in which the police and the CPS work together on these cases, would yield results. And I'm glad to say that we have seen a progressive increase in the number of cases brought. I don't think we're there yet, and I think that we've still got to give this a bit of time and a lot more will in order to get to a position where we can then look back at, let's go back to the Stern review, which was done over 10 years ago, where Baroness Stern produced an impressive piece of work that acknowledged the fact that there are many, many victims and complainants who don't want to go through prosecution and want other means by which they can come to terms with and get support for their trauma. But until we get the prosecution element right, and until we see the right balance, I don't think we can then go on to offer that sort of wide range of different options so the victims feel that they're respected, that they're listened to, that action is taken early, and that they're not having to relive the trauma all over again in a way that frankly causes these attrition rates. So I hope that, and from what I see in the bill, there are certain measures and initiatives here that I think will help in that process. But it does require, and I emphasise this, Dr. Alan Khan, a huge amount of political will and the attention of this place in order to make sure that the authorities are doing what you want on behalf of your constituents them to do.
Thank you.
I call Harriet Croft.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I had a quick question on definitions in the bill and how that might impact on the pressure on number of cases coming to court. And largely it's the ones which need a level of subjectiveness coming in. So, for example, where there's just judgment or if someone judges something or reasonable grounds for belief, would it be the case that either could and then would, if these were tightened up, it would feed through to actually making sure that the right cases come to magistrates or other courts and it would help the backlog? Or is that something that we think just in terms of putting the pressure back on the police on the ground, it would just be too much to put back sort of into the front line?
I'm not sure I'm able to answer that question. I haven't considered the matter in great detail. And when I haven't considered something, I tend not to answer the question. So you must forgive me if I pass on that one to a politician who no doubt has no such inhibitions.
No, I've never had any inhibitions, as I think you all well know. Look, I think we've just got to go back to the fundamentals here. You shouldn't be bringing prosecution cases unless there's a reasonable prospect of conviction and it's in the public interest. That's the very simple test for prosecutors. So you need the evidence. And that's where things can often be a very difficult task for our investigating authorities. I don't want to labour the point, well, I will labour the point because I think it's really important. We are faced with extrinsic challenges where digital and assistive technology is being used on a scale and at a pace that is at once awe-inspiring and at once terrifying. Unless we can enable our police and investigative agencies to have the same level of firepower, we're never going to win. And we are going to have increasing difficulty in putting together and piecing together cases that can then be prosecuted. And I think particularly about fraud, I think particularly about the use of blockchain and virtual technology. I want to make sure that whether it's the SFO, whether it's the CPS, whether it's the City of London Police, and all the work that's being done to try and improve our response to fraud, that we are really on it when it comes to technology. And I think the ministers will know this, the Criminal Justice Board is the ideal forum for this to be prioritised. Ministers can make it their priority and can absolutely give tasks to all the arms of the criminal justice system to get this right. We did it with rape, we've done it with other types of criminality. I think this is the moment, if it isn't being seized now, that the Lord Chancellor and the Home Secretary can really step up and make sure that our response to cybercrime is not just as good, but ahead of what we are seeing and the trends that we are seeing now, not just here, but internationally. So it's those extrinsic threats that I think are a real wake-up call.
Thank you. A quick minute, I'll call Keir Mather.
Thank you, Chair. So, Robert, you've got vast experience in the reality that large crime and policing bills such as this one need intense cooperation between the criminal justice system, frontline officers, the prison service and the courts. From your experience in government, do you perhaps have one or two lessons of how we can better improve that cooperation?
Well, we haven't got all day, Mr. Mather, but there's a lot I can say. Having done, this bill's a relative minnow compared to the 22 Act, which was, of course, the combined bill that I did with the then Home Secretary. I think the important thing is to make sure that legislative intent and political intent doesn't run too far ahead of operational reality. And I'll give you an example when it comes to what we did on, this is going back a bit now, when I was still a backbencher, on stalking. You know, we changed the law on stalking. I think Dan was certainly involved. It was a cross-party achievement. We did it in record time. We got the law changed within months. It was an incredible achievement. But the police weren't operationally ready. And I still see evidence, even now, 10 years on, of a lack of training and awareness about the telltale signs of stalking. So I think the message I'd give to all of you, particularly the parliamentarians who are cutting their teeth on this bill, is make sure you read the impact assessments, make sure that ministers can answer your questions about operational reality, and make sure that the police chiefs, the CPS, that all the agencies who have got the job of doing this are ready and resourced to make the legislative intent a reality. Otherwise, your constituents are going to be coming back to you in a few years saying, why haven't there been any prosecutions under this new effect?
That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. I thank our witnesses on behalf of the committee for their evidence. Thank you. Thank you very much. We will now hear oral evidence from Spike Aware UK. Once again, we must stick to the timings in the programme motion the committee has agreed. For this session, we will have until 1 o'clock.
What's this?
I'll get him to introduce himself. Yeah. Getting there. Hello. Could the witness please introduce himself for the record?
Good afternoon. I'm Colin Mackie. I'm the chair and co-founder member of Spike Aware UK.
First of all, you'll have seen we get lots of people in here who are very familiar with these places, and then every now and again we get people who are brave, committed, dedicated to making a change, making the world a better place. So thank you for coming. Thank you for all the campaigning you're doing on this issue. All power to your elbow. The question from me is, how important are the measures coming forward in this bill, and why are they so important? And or equally, is there anything you think that the government should be doing beyond what is in this bill?
I think this is majorly important. I think it's a giant step forward, because up until now, spiking's been a very grey area. There's been so many, it's either charged under assault, theft, poisoning, whatever. And that's the thing, it's been such a grey area, it's been hard to process it. That has got the knock-on effect of putting victims off coming forward because they don't know where they're going to go, what's going to be talked about, and they're unsure. Perpetrators who are conducting this spiking thing, they feel that, well, nothing's really happening over this, so don't hear anybody getting charged for it. It's only a bit of fun. We don't think we're going to do any harm, so they carry on doing it. So to actually have a standalone offence, I think it's beneficial for the victims to see this coming. I also think it's beneficial for the police, because I feel that once it is a law in place, you're going to get a coordinated response from police. Currently, victims in Newcastle are treated differently from victims in Newquay, and that's the same across the whole of the country. And that's one of the major problems, is victims that talk to us all the time. Some of them, great, other ones, not so good. I've had one victim say, police said they didn't have the manpower to go in and check for CCTV, they didn't have the time to check CCTV at the club where they were spiked. And another victim who came in and said, uniformed officers turned up, wasn't sure how to deal with it. Half an hour later, the CID were there, straight into the club. So that inconsistency is something that we can't have, so we need to move forward with that. You're saying earlier on as well, what can we do to help? I think to bring in the bill for the law, we also have to involve A&E, because I think A&E have a big part to play in this as well. Because all too often, as you know, it is the job of the police to gather the evidence. But a spiking victim is likely to appear at a hospital or A&E, confused, unconscious, not sure what's going on. They're not going to think about asking for a police officer to attend. They're not in a state to do that. So unless they've got a family member or a friend there, that's not going to happen. By the time we go maybe 2 days down the line and think, yeah, this is what's happened to me, I want to report this, the evidence is gone. There's a good chance a lot of the evidence is gone, and that's what we need in the bill as well, for A&E to play a bigger part, gather the evidence there, hold it for the police, And then if the victim wants to take it forward, it's there.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Khan. Thank you, Colin, for coming today and echoing the words of the Shadow Minister, all the work you do on this. It's really, really appreciated. You mentioned the need, you welcoming the clarification in the bill. We're creating the specific offence of spiking by using the word of spiking. Can you expand on why that will make such a difference for victims? You mentioned some of the issues with the police using different types of offences at the minute. Why will it make such a difference to have this specific offence?
A victim will then recognise that that is an offence. When they approach the police, spiking is there. Currently, they're not sure, can they report it? They're nervous. They're not sure if it is an offence. And that's been a big thing that we get fed to us. And I think, taking away from just like the girls, there's a lot of spiking going on with boys now. The males have been spiked as well. Anybody is possible to be spiked. And that's a big thing, because we find that a lot of males think it's a girl's problem. So they don't tend to, they think it's tied in with a sexual assault or whatever. So I think that if you actually just say spiking, males will think, yeah, I have been spiked. And that is it. It's the fact that I've been spiked. A lot of spikings are now taking place and nothing else is happening. They're not being sexually assaulted. They're not being robbed. They're just being spiked. Is what we kind of call prank spiking. People are doing it because they can. So I think coming forward and just saying, yes, I have been spiked, and there's a law in spiking, I think is the way forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the other things you touched upon, and it was referenced by the previous witness before you, was around how important it is not to just make legislative change, but to have that package of support available with the other agencies around it. So what can you recommend to us in terms of not just making a legislative change, but you mentioned A&E, but also training, guidance, etc., to really make sure that this is a package of spiking for spiking offences? Yeah,
we certainly want to get the nighttime industry more involved, getting stewards more aware, because all too often one of the first things said to someone who's been spiked, or the friends of someone who's been spiked, is they're drunk. I want them out of the club. They're drunk, they've had too much to drink. And when we talk to nightclubs and bars, etc., what we'll say to the stewards is, listen to what the friends are saying. Don't make the assumption that that person's drunk just because they look drunk. If their friends are saying, we've had 1 or 2 drinks, take on board what they're saying. Don't just think, oh no, I've got to get this person out of here, because they've got a duty of care to look after people. And that is the thing that we want them to take the responsibility of it. Because just even at the weekend there, I was reading an article in the BBC, and it was talking about nightclubs in general, how the footfall's falling. And one of the examples said that youngsters are stopping going to nightclubs because of the fear of spiking. So if they've got to look at the bigger picture for their own industry and realise, if we put in this stuff, we've got in lids, deterrents, better security, better CCTV, and start to see, hopefully with this new bill, people being prosecuted, then the numbers will come back up. People have the confidence to come out. If they think they're going to a venue where they feel they're going to be safe, they're more likely to come. Whereas currently, they're walking away and they're finding something else to do. So it's going to affect the nighttime industry as well, so they really have to take it more serious.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Luke Taylor.
Thank you, and thank you again for coming along and your campaigning on this. You must be proud that you've kind of got this leap and this legislation here ready to try and combat some of the trauma that obviously you've experienced. Bit of a broader question. Does the measures included in the bill cover all of the issues that you see around the offence? Do you think it's a comprehensive, not solution, but measure to enable action to be taken to combat the horrible offence that spiking is?
I think it is. It's moving forward to that level that I think it is good. The sentencing side of it, I would like to see a wee bit more, because just listening to the previous witnesses there, I know there's a backlog, of what's happening through the courts and everything, and that I can see being a problem if people who want to report the spiking, especially if it's young women, are going to think, well, if it's going to last 2 years, and this is me just listening to the previous witnesses, how much of a deterrent is that going to be for people to come forward if they think it's going to drag on? So that's one bit I could see, you know, when it comes to the census, how quickly would this be processed, and would that put people off reporting it?
Thank you.
David.
Thank you, Chair, and I echo the words of my colleagues. Thank you for all you do in this area. It's a vitally important area. You rightly said that spiking affects everybody. It is something that men and women can be prone to, unfortunately. But obviously the government's got a target of halving the level of violence against women and girls. And this is hopefully part of that package. How important do you think it is to have this in this bill as part of the package of halving violence against women and girls?
It's certainly very important, because to begin with, girls were the major target. They still are the highest target in the group, and it is all about people want to go out and enjoy themselves. Women should be able to go out just to have a night out with friends and be confident that they're safe. If they want to leave that drink for a second, they should be able to leave that drink. They shouldn't have to worry about going up to dance or go to the toilet or just be distracted because someone's going to add something to the drink. So yeah, that's a great way of moving forward, because moving forward in the future, you want all youngsters to be able to say, yeah, I'm going for a night out and I want to have a nice, safe night out. And that's the way forward. It's got to be the way forward.
Thank you.
Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the purpose of why someone might spike in the bill includes words injure, aggrieve and annoy. Could there be any other purpose from your experience why somebody might seek to spike that's not captured in, say, annoy is probably the broadest term?
Revenge. Possibly revenge. You know, someone would maybe spike someone just because a girl could spike another girl because she's jealous. For example, something that's already happened before, an ex-boyfriend in particular could also maybe, or ex-girlfriend in some cases, could spike someone. So revenge to me is another possibility.
And could there be something that might appear more frivolous, that could be an excuse, but is, because you talked about pranking, but still needs to be captured by this bill and may not be captured by the word annoy?
Yeah, pranking is probably the one, you know, that's what they will do. It's totally random. There's no reason for a lot of what they do. It's they pick a victim out, and having spoken to police officers, one of the things they talk about is drugs have become so easily accessible and so cheap that is why the kind of prank spiking is growing a bit. Now, I spoke to a group from Australia who said spiking had dropped slightly, and they said the reason was that the police had done a blitz on drugs. So the price of drugs had gone up, and when the price of drugs went up, the spiking came down. So there's always a chance that it's just because they can easily access these drugs and they will just use them.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm afraid this will probably have to be the last question to this witness. I call Lauren Sullivan.
Lovely. Thank you, Madam Chair. It was interesting to hear about the experiences with A&E, and in particular, some of the drugs disappeared from the bloodstream very quickly. We're looking at kind of new diagnostic tests and a kind of safeguarding duty at A&E to run those tests maybe immediately when people arrive. I mean, just your thoughts on that, really?
Yeah, that's what I would like to see. You know, once the person appears there, and I've spoken to some medics, and again, it goes back to listen what the friends say. If they say they've only had one or two drinks, but they're out, you know, they're unconscious, hallucinating, obviously under the influence of something, then you've got to gather it early doors, because if you don't do it, you're going to lose that evidence, which is so vital. And again, it's going to give the people the confidence that they know if they get taken to A&E, they're going to be taken serious. They're not going to be 2 days down the line saying, I just wish someone had taken the sample then. Especially if some do suspect, they think they know who did it, but it's maybe 2 days down the line or 3 days down the line before they say, well, I think it was that person, or it happened at that bar around that time, but that evidence is gone, so you really want to gather it there. It's something like someone who's in the hospital who's maybe suffered sexual assault. They'll gather the evidence quite quickly, when they appear in the A&E, and I'd like to see the same happening with spiking.
Order. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. I thank our witness on behalf of the committee for your evidence. It's been really, really helpful. And that brings us to the end of our morning session. The committee will meet again at 2 p.m. this afternoon here in the Boothroyd room to continue taking oral evidence. I now invite the Government Whip to propose the adjournment.
I'd like to move that this committee do now adjourn.
The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order.